When I speak with leaders, that are in their, let's call it mid-30s, the conversation is as follows. It's like, look, I've got a mortgage or I'm trying to save for a house. My partner and I have young kids or we're starting a family. And on top of that, they don't go to the gym. They don't see their friends. And work is essentially a never-ending battle. If that's the 80% of people that are in the sort of tech industry and the conversations you're having, hey, by the way, Sunday is a work day too, is a pretty rough conversation for that individual. So that creates a ton of stress. And so part of the reason we do this kind of podcast episode is to note that there are 8 segments, not 1. And they may be quite qualified for this, but perhaps this is not the time. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Skip Podcast. This is the last episode of the year. I'm joined by my co-host, Carly Malatsky, and I'm Nikhil Singhal. And the two of us are going to tackle this theme that we've been working on over the fall and winter, which is the kind of core set of questions that so many of our listeners have, which is, am I in the right company? It's a relatively simple question, but I think 2 out of every 3 people that we interact with are, struggling to figure out, should I make a move in 2026? Is the company I'm at going to teach me the right things? Am I becoming less relevant? Or should I stay because the market's really tight, because I'm not qualified, because I have some constraints? These are really tough questions. And I think, Carly, you and I talked about how one person's advice of stay might be radically different from the person next to them, which is absolutely, you should go. And so career advice is really personal. And so our attempt over the last 2 episodes was to sort of come back with some case studies and frameworks to help people navigate this. That framework, and just to summarize, was a combination of trying to understand your constraints. What are your income requirements? Where are you in career? Where are you in terms of geolocation? Are you a builder? Are you a manager? Understanding that gives us the ability to triangulate what types of doors are closed to you, what types of doors are open to you. And by doors, we refer to sort of 8 segments of companies that we've come back with. And so that was published last episode. And these segments are interesting because when someone calls me with this core question of, should I stay, should I go? I kind of look at their constraints, look at their qualifications, and then do this calculation across each of the 8 doors. Are they qualified for big tech? Would they be better off at a larger, maybe older enterprise tech company? Are they a good candidate for these mid-quality companies? Are they actually a good candidate for these high-quality later-stage companies like the Stripes, the Databricks, the Rubrics, or some of the recent IPOs? These 4 larger stage companies are very popular. They obviously employ the vast majority of people in technology because they're the largest of organizations. And that was our part 2. That was the last episode that we kind of talked through, is taking questions from you, the listeners, using Nikhil AI. We now have 700-800 questions that have come in of people that are asking about, what's the right next move, and we're mapping that to these types of different segments. Today's episode, we're going to focus on the AI labs and the hot AI startups. These kind of AI revolution companies are some of the most interesting that people are asking about, but they have very high qualifications and very deep constraints. And then there's these higher risk plays, which are, a lot of you that are listening are in what I would call an X-growth company. And some of you are thinking or at early stage founding Series A type opportunities. So the questions that came in kind of map to these segments as well. So instead of jamming it all into last episode, we decided to make this episode part 3. So we're recording kind of questions that people came in with these 4 segments. And hopefully when you look at all 3 episodes together, if you've got a long road trip here in the next couple months, you can kind of listen to 5 hours of Carly and I talking through what's your next move. So anyway, I look forward to chatting with you about this, Carly. Thanks again for joining me. I will turn it over to you. Hope you're doing well.
Of course. It's always great to be with you, Nikhil. Okay, let's just dive right in. So as you said, we're going to start with AI labs, if you will. So, right, those are the OpenAIs, Anthropics of the world. So, our first question, I'm going to read it out and we'll go from there. So, I've been managing teams for the last 5 years. OpenAI rejected me after the first interview. They said they wanted someone, quote, closer to the product. What does that even mean when I've been shipping products for years? How do I position myself for AI-focused roles when I don't have direct AI experience?
Yeah, so this segment of company, I would say, is pretty narrowly defined. I think it's narrowly defined in that we're talking about the AI labs, we're talking about Anthropic, we're talking about OpenAI, we're talking about Perplexity. We have a pretty good vantage point into how OpenAI has operated, although I think it's changing every 3 to 6 months as the company's going through a lot of growth. The Skip community that I put together has some folks from Perplexity, has some folks from OpenAI, and definitely some folks from Anthropic joining. And so we have a pretty good sense of what it's like to work within these organizations. And I think the number one thing that this question is kind of focused on is like, how hands-on do you have to be in order to be effective? I think this is a little bit of a surprise to people, but though the company's growing really quickly, they continue to look for people that are very, very hands-on. The note that was made to me is a lot of the genetics of these organizations are that AI researchers build magic. They aren't necessarily clear on what product it can embody, but they'll create some magic, so some magical interface for voice. And they'll look for folks like in product to actually turn that magic into something that a consumer like you and I can use. And that's a very, very specific skill. So if you aren't able to get very into the detail on what the technology enables, if you aren't able to then turn that into what customers could want, and then manage the massaging of turning a research project into a full-blown product that works at hundreds of millions of users at scale, then it's going to be very challenging for you to be effective there. So I think in the past, when we've seen companies go through hypergrowth, like these organizations are going through, they immediately said, we need managers, we need middle managers, we need layers of hierarchy, because boy, in order to grow, we need scale, which means lots of people, which means we need lots of people around to coordinate that growth. That's not the case here. Here, they're trying to move as flat as possible because their belief is that the closer you are to the technology, the more you'll be able to have shots on goal. And then over some period of time, I would not be surprised if there is management layers that are introduced. But, my honest opinion is that most of those will go to insiders. So if the question is like, hey, I've been managing for a while and I'm trying to break into OpenAI, the path to breaking in for most of these AI labs is to get hands-on, to be very strong on the research, to be very opinionated on the product side and how you can connect the two. And then once you have some wins, you might be able to, quote unquote, resume your management career. I know several people that have taken that step back, but, honestly now moving that 2 steps forward because they're able to take on big responsibility, but that's only after 6 to 12 months of some degree of iteration.
Say, you're a listener right now and you naturally fall into the manager category rather than the builder. And you actually get excited by being a manager. You love leading teams and you're not really the hands-on getting dirty with the tech. In that sense, maybe it's not the best door to walk through to go to these AI labs. That's essentially what you're kind of saying. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a good clarification. I think that a lot of it has to do with your mindset and what you're willing to do. So what we talked about a little bit last time is that when you're a manager and you're essentially saying like your next job is probably a management role, I think it's going to limit your ability to join a company at this stage. Most of these companies are looking for hands-on starting points. So you have to ask yourself, if you're listening to this podcast, that, hey, are you the type of manager who's sort of like, look, that IC role, that hands-on role, that was who I was yesterday. I don't see myself doing that at this stage of career for a variety of reasons. Okay, there's no judgment, but it's unlikely that this style of company, and frankly, several of the sectors that we're going to talk about here in a second, will also probably not be appropriate, which is why the last episode, when we talked about these larger companies that have many more inside the building problems than outside the building problems, those sectors, those case studies, those segments are going to be a lot more appropriate for your kind of management as your next role type situation. But in this sector, we really want people to be hands-on, and that's really the requirement, regardless of how senior you are.
Okay, this is great. These next two questions actually will support this even more. So, this next one, I'm at Amazon as a senior product manager. I interviewed with OpenAI and Anthropic, but didn't make it past the initial rounds. I obviously don't mind going back to IC at those high quality companies, but I am curious, how many years should I spend at Amazon before trying again?
I like this question because it points on two things. One is that we talked a little bit about an anomaly that AI labs have, which is one, they want people hands-on. I think two is they tend to want to productize research, which is a relatively new and very specific skill. And I think that those that have that skill will do well in the labs, but they won't necessarily do well in a sort of a generic setting because it is a very specific skill. I think the third thing that this question kind of notes is that, they were able to interview both OpenAI and Anthropic. One thing I've observed is that those companies tend to interview pretty aggressively. So they tend to have a very open funnel on terms of who they talk to. And it might be because the skills come from unobvious places to productize research. A vast majority of people I talk to, they're not asking, hey, I've never been able to get attention from these AI labs. They actually have a question that starts more like, I'm gone through some percentage of the process with those companies. So I would say that they're pretty wide in whom they talk to, but I would not take that as a signal that you're qualified. I think that they just tend to want to be pretty open-minded. And so a lot of people struggle to get through a process. So the core of this question is, what skills can I gain from Amazon to kind of go, if this becomes my destination and I'm early in career and I'm not worried about some of the constraints, what I'd really like to do is, improve my stock. And the answer I would say is, we need to look very carefully at the story that you're building at Amazon. What project are you working on? What opinions do you have? Are you able to follow those opinions into something that releases, that actually goes out the door, where customers have contact with it? And then are you able to articulate how your opinions worked out and then what adjustments you made to continue to iterate? The second note I would say is the more you are building those opinions, the more that you are hands-on, to the earlier point, the more effective you will be in the next interview, because they're going to want to hear your opinions. They're going to want to hear how detailed you are. The headwinds you face is a company like an Amazon or an Apple or a Google or a Microsoft. Those organizations, a lot of the skills you build, just to be completely direct, a lot of the skills you build are inside the building skills. And when you're building inside the building skills, they're less valued at this stage by the labs, because their feeling is there's a gigantic blank sheet of paper that they're trying to fill in as rapidly as possible. And they're in this sort of fight against time to kind of continue to iterate and improve the models. So they're very interested in taking this technology and just applying it in as many places as possible, which is a really different skill than anything that you'll experience at a late stage tech company. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think what I love about that answer, by the way, is that in a way, this person's asking the question, just assuming that I should stay at Amazon, right? And you're saying like, okay, but there's actually this way where you should take a step back and see, like, is it actually even conducive to you to stay at Amazon if the ultimate goal is to go and, work at either a hot AI startup or whatever it may be, or an AI lab like we're talking here. And I think you're going back to, what story are you telling, which I think is so important. And we emphasize that a lot in the last episode.
I think that you're essentially saying that, well, the person is saying Amazon is one possibility and going to these AI labs is another possibility. But boy, what about all the other things that you could do in between? Like if you were to go found, for example, just kind of skipping ahead a second, and you failed after a couple of years, you're probably going to be a lot more relevant to an Anthropic, because you've done exactly what we've said. You've been hands-on, you've had to be pretty wide in your skill set, you've had to be pretty good about being opinionated, and you certainly are staring at a blank sheet of paper. That's going to be really a better proving ground if this is ultimately your destination. So don't be so narrow-minded and stay at Amazon or until I can go to OpenAI. That's a pretty that's a pretty tough and perhaps very unusually narrow kind of career path.
Okay, this next question, what I'm excited about for this one is it very much emulates the concept of the skip, right? Which is like this whole podcast, what you're building, because it's almost like, even if I go to this job, what does that set me up for? So let me see. Okay, I was a senior AI PM at a private late stage tech company. I've just accepted a PM role at Google working on LLMs. Does this move make sense as a stepping stone toward eventually landing at Anthropic or OpenAI?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I think it's a big deal to be able to go to a Google and work on an AI product. I think what we've talked about is half of what we're trying to do is upgrade your product intuition around how do products get formed in today's world. And then half of it is the org structures that are responsible to building those products. And so one of the nice things about working in an AI area on a winning product, in this case, Gemini, is you're definitely going to get some relevancy around how the newest products are being built. You're going to have that kind of fast movement, high competition. It's going to be a particularly focused area of innovation, a high quality peer set. So there's a lot of good things here. And all of those things are going to contribute to your skip job, whether that's going to be at OpenAI, Anthropic, or any of these other segments that we're talking through. There are going to be lots of doors that are going to be open to you. But I would say that half of what you'll be dealing with, and perhaps even more than half, depending on your role, is that, Google's a gigantic company. Alphabet, I should say, is a gigantic company. And because it's such a large company, they have a lot to protect. And because they have a lot to protect, there's a lot of internal forces that are designed to slow down progress that exists because of the success of the organization. That doesn't exist because as one gets older, one just, becomes more change averse. I think it's because there is just an incredible business that's underneath. And so a lot of what you'll learn as a senior PM in Google is how to influence and navigate those organizational structures. Today, that is not a critical factor in, I would say, the interview process at Anthropic and OpenAI. To succeed once one joins those companies, you have to have a lot of those skills because there is now a lot to protect at those companies. And certainly in a few years, those companies are going to be massive. They're going to have layers and there's going to be a lot there. So I would say this is a stepping stone, probably far more than if the person stayed in their current role. The difference between working at Google, which is a good company, on a hands-on role, working on AI and doing that for a small number of years is going to be interesting. But what I would say also, and this is worth pointing out, is that a lot of the conversations I've had with these AI labs, they're not particularly focused on recruiting people with pre-existing AI experience because it's a young science. So there's not that many technologists that are out there that have worked in AI already. And a lot of times the skill is to productize what the researchers are doing. It doesn't mean that they don't like pre-existing AI experience, but if you're going because you think, boy, I'm going to have a really good understanding of how LLMs are structured, I think that's a nice to have. What really matters is your creativity, your width of understanding of the product process, and your ability to kind of ship and influence. And so I would say that you're not improving dramatically your stock because you're getting domain expertise, because the domain expertise today isn't that critical, but you're absolutely getting a sense of how to rapidly iterate on a very competitive product that clearly is in the same space. And so it'll work in your favor. So hopefully those nuances make sense.
Okay, I'm going to read another one now. This is more, we're actually going a little bit more towards another constraint about just location. So I moved from a big tech PM to an operational role at OpenAI. I increasingly feel I'm away from the core of the action. Part of it is my location. I moved back to New York City from SF, and part of it is my team and function. The PM manager said I'd have to move back to SF to join their team. Waiting for the NYC office to expand feels passive.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a bit of a catch-all question around, where's the heat? I think in product management in particular, it's a smaller and more of a laggy function. Engineering teams tend to be built first, and then they go to market teams, and then finally the product teams. And where we sit today, and this won't necessarily be the case in maybe 12 months, but where we sit today is the vast majority of the work in AI is being done in the Bay Area. And so if you're taking a role outside the Bay Area, just as this person signaled, you may have to make some sacrifice. In this case, they had to exit PM and they had to work in something else. And I think that it is absolutely the case that whether you are specifically trying to navigate OpenAI and say, look, I want to move back to PM, but I have to go to San Francisco, that is probably a comment that may apply more than just at OpenAI. If you wanted to leave and go join another company and be in an AI forward setting, the vast majority of those roles are in the Bay Area as well. So what I would say is it is going to be the case that product management as a function is not going to explode. It's not going to be the case that there's an unlimited number of positions. There's 50 being hired every quarter. I think you will see probably companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and others double their product management staff, but they're probably going to be very conservative in doing that outside the Bay Area. And there's going to be plenty of interest for Bay Area people to join. And so I would not be trying to manage one career by saying that, hey, I want to be in product management at one of these hot companies and want to stay outside the Bay Area. Just that the evidence doesn't really exist that that's the case. And so if you do get one of those roles, you're one of the few and far between. So in this case, you got to move. Yeah, you got to move if you want to move into product management. And I think that perhaps it'll also help you in your skip job as well.
Okay, the last one in this category is it actually encapsulates everything, which I'm excited about. So I'm a principal PM at Atlassian weighing an IC offer from OpenAI. It's an IC role with highly specific scope, compensation security, but I need to relocate to SF. I'm worried about the increase in cost of living, plus my spouse would need to find a new job as well. Is OpenAI worth upending everything?
This obviously is a very personal question. There's talking about a spouse, and we don't know if that's going to make a difficult job search, for them as well. My sense is that the key in this question is the principal PM at Atlassian. I think that what we want to sort of look at is there's sort of what would you have to believe to say, yes, it's worth upending, and what would you have to believe to say, no, it's not? And that's the way I usually answer these questions. So what you would have to believe to say yes is that you would do really well at OpenAI, and you perhaps feel like your career is a bit more on pause at Atlassian. So if you're essentially saying like, I'm one of the sharper people at this current company, I feel like I want to do more AI forward things, but I feel like I'm being held back, not by my own ambition or my own hours, but that the products themselves are maybe older. My coworkers aren't really helping. The sort of nature of this pace of work is a slower one. And these are all the things that we covered in that segment when we talked about Atlassian. And if you're like, boy, this is really a struggle for me. And so I feel like I've out of area. I've, have a lot of ambition. Career is a big priority for me, but I've essentially have this sort of headwind on my career that I could race by moving. And frankly, I proved it by being able to get this IC offer from OpenAI. And OpenAI is, as we've talked about, is quite selective on the talent that they bring in. It's very hard to get all the way through process. So they have a real opportunity. And if that's the case, then my sense is that not only is OpenAI representative of a good, solid next couple of years for this individual, but it could be life-changing. It could mean that they change the trajectory of all the next jobs that they have. OpenAI might be a dramatic compensation improvement, as the person already noted, and it might be something that the person's really qualified for. So their dream scenario is that they want to basically push super, super hard. Maybe they and their partner do not have kids, and this is something that they really want to focus on for a few years. And no matter how many hours they put it in Atlassian, it won't make much of a difference. Then I would say it is worth upending everything because it could dramatically change the direction of one's life, compensation-wise, choices-wise, and it could make them very, very happy because they'll feel like their career matches their ambition. They feel like they're overqualified and they always were held back. That's a future regret that they'll never get past, perhaps, as they get into their later stage of life. However, the alternative, if we argue the con side, we could say that, well, what if they were doing really well at Atlassian? And what if they were being seen? And what if they're one of the better people there? Principal PM is probably quite a senior level of positioning. And what if they took the job at OpenAI and they didn't do very well? Because OpenAI is not an easy place to work. A lot of people struggle in their first year. There's a lot of chaos because of the growth. They might be a victim of multiple organizational changes. They might get thrown into a project where they have very little management because, as we've talked about, it's a pretty flat structure. And the next thing they know, 6 months later, they're miserable. They're not being seen at work. They're struggling. They haven't been able to lean on their friends because they're in a new city. Their spouse is struggling because they haven't been able to find work. And they're sitting there and saying, hey, are we just one of those people that came to San Francisco with a dream and they're really struggling? I think that's a big negative because I think that they'll look back and they'll regret that decision. And, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be able to go back to a role at Atlassian. So it's probably not a one-way door. But what I would note is it's not a guarantee that OpenAI is a superior situation until you evaluate one's ability to succeed there and how they're being seen at Atlassian. And lastly, their relationship to work with the rest of their life. Work is not that critical if they have, family that they're surrounded by in their current location. They moved to San Francisco purely for work. And it turns out that that was a bad trade-off. These are the kinds of conversations that I'd want to have before we make kind of a definitive call.
Right. And I think what you're highlighting overall is that there are so many variables that come into it, right? And so we only described one element of it. But I could also assume and, argue that the fact that they even apply to OpenAI, the fact that they're now weighing this IC offer rather than, their current job, right? They obviously have some type of pull to say like, okay, I want to go now into AI more, or there's something not as truly fulfilling in my current role at Atlassian. So there is that element. But given that you weighed two stark contrasts, right, that this person should think through, what do you think is like the most likely situation to happen given this question?
I mean, I think your insight that they wouldn't be asking the question if there wasn't some pre-existing anxiety is probably the tipping factor. My guess is if they're earlier in career, and they probably are probably in the first 10 years of career, given that they're, talking about IC and principal PM, et cetera, if they're at that stage, they might be more interested in taking risk. And that's really what this comes down to is what's their risk profile as a family unit. And I think that if you're interviewing at OpenAI and you've gotten all the way through process, it has dawned on you that you might need to move. This might be a big change in lifestyle. And the fact that you continue to stick with it implies that the person's probably open to change. And usually, if they're open to change, they're going to want to take a risk and see what happens. So my hunch is if I was to guess what the person will end up doing is they will end up upending everything, but they might do that in a thoughtful way. Perhaps they may, move there and leave the spouse so that they ensure that they hit their 1 year, or they might end up in a situation where they are very, very sure of the manager before they go in. And, it might be an area that they have expertise in, so they feel very comfortable. So you'd want to mitigate it a little bit. But my hunch is that it's probably at this era worth taking that risk because the contrast between an Atlassian and OpenAI is pretty high. And most people that can get that job will want to kind of move to the fast lane, if you will.
Totally. And if anything, naturally, like having that pull, the skip job is even more, the doors are probably going to open way more as well, having that behind you.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the main thing that I always want to get people to understand. I'm glad you pushed on this, is that if you're very short-sighted, you're like, OpenAI, if it doesn't work out, let's say it doesn't pay out, like I have these conversations. Sometimes they're like, well, I'm at Atlassian, and if OpenAI, doesn't triple in valuation, then I'll probably end up having not a major change in salary. And so I feel like lots of good things would have to happen for the OpenAI move to be worth it. And I'm like, I don't actually agree with that. Like, let's assume that OpenAI didn't pay out. Like, your stock of what your next job versus being like year 8 at Atlassian versus having year 6 at Atlassian and 2 years at OpenAI. I mean, you couldn't imagine the distinction between what jobs you can get. So like, think of it that way. So the calculation is if you succeed in 2 years at a relatively modern company, building one of the more, one of the bigger names out there, you're going to have a very different trajectory. And lots of people are going to want you in their company, which is not the case if you become like a manager at Atlassian and you're in year 8. It's just there's going to be a lot of you in the market compared to a few of you if you're at OpenAI.
Okay, that's actually a perfect segue. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on in this store before we go on to now the hot AI startups and the Sierra Decagons of the world?
The one last thing that I would signal is the pace at these labs is high. And we didn't take any specific questions related to pace from people looking at AI labs. We're going to take them in the next segment. What I would say is that when I've dug deep into what pace is like at those organizations, what I hear is that there's a very high expectation that work is a priority, but people can still retain a life and maintain some semblance of boundaries. There is an expectation that people are online, and almost all of these segments, there's an expectation that people are online all the time. So if I contrast a role at Meta, a role at OpenAI, and a role in a startup, like the founding level role, there's more similarities than differences. If you need to go and travel or take a PTO or a vacation, you can do it. If you have a 4:00 Friday appointment that you have to keep on the books, you can kind of maintain that. It is possible. I think in the next segment, we'll find that that's actually harder to do because of just the sheer push in the companies. But I would say that the pace is very, very high at these organizations, and there's a lot of burnout. But a large number of people that work at OpenAI have kids, as an example. And so it is possible to maintain a life and have boundaries.
All right. The next question is, I'm an IC at Big Tech considering a senior agent PM role at Decagon. I take a pay cut and my peers would be less experienced than myself. But I feel stuck at Big Tech. Is joining a hot AI startup worth the step backwards?
Yes. Decagon in this example is one of a set of companies that are just doing very, very well. They happen to be in the AI customer agent space. I think that if we evaluate the criteria around, hey, what are the next 3 or 4 jobs going to look like? If you're an IC at Big Tech, most likely your next set of jobs as you mature at Big Tech is going to be other Big Tech companies. And if you are a senior PM at Decagon, the choices could be much more broad, including Big Tech. So from just the criteria, I'm always trying to optimize how many types of jobs and settings I can get and I'm qualified for and I'm seen for. Almost certainly a diversity at this stage will help if you get the offer. Now, this particular question did not indicate that they got the offer. It indicates that they are considering interviewing. So I think that it's almost certainly the case to determine if the company sees you as qualified, because that's always a good signal. I think that this person says that they're stuck at Big Tech. You don't get unstuck. My experience is that it's not that you find another project and you all of a sudden things are moving more fluidly. What you do find is managers that you might be more simpatico with. You might find projects that grow more quickly, or areas that are more mature, or areas that are more or less functional. But you don't necessarily, when you have that feeling of stuck, it essentially is that feeling that I want to move faster and the headwinds that protect the business, they're really slowing me down. And that's very common for good reason. And so if you're already feeling that anxiety and you're qualified to take a hot startup, this is almost certainly a good move. Now, this idea that you have to take less pay or that your peers are less experienced, let's talk about that for just a second. I think it's unlikely as an IC in Big Tech that you will be taking a pay cut. I think your liquid pay will be less. I think that the theory is that the equity, though it would be smaller as an individual contributor than it would be as a manager or as an executive, that equity could be very valuable. But I think if you're looking over the next 10 years of salary, I think it's very hard to argue that you will be taking a clear pay cut. I think you will run a risk adjusted basis. Big tech is going to pay well, but you can always return to big tech if you take this route. So I'm not at all convinced that this is a major pay cut. In fact, most people think of it, particularly leaders, think of it as perhaps a way to really get breakout compensation. I think the peers less experience is the really interesting part. We spoke about this, if you recall, earlier in the big tech segment, where we're asking, like, hey, I'm going to have to come in and I'll be the adult. In this example, I always say that, the ideal scenario is that you're in a high quality company and you're better than your peer set. So I agree that most of the people are experienced because they are installing product management at these companies as we speak. So the job that you are joining is you are one of the very first product people. The notion of product management is now just coming on board as the companies have achieved product market fit, but they're growing really rapidly. And you're being brought in because you know the function. The people that are there know the product, know the customer, know the technology. So it's a wonderful opportunity for you to feel smart and add value. I would actually flip this around and say, I'm an IC at big tech, considering a PM role at a hot company. Pay wise, it's a crapshoot. It may be more, maybe less, it may be similar. I think I'm more experienced than my peers, so I'll probably have a pretty strong year one. I think today I feel pretty stuck in my current company because I feel like I can move way faster than we move. So I think that this is a step forward, not a step backward. The only reason to be a step backward is if I somehow really struggle to make the move, or I'm very, very risk averse, or most importantly, the hours are just unsustainable. I think that's the area that maybe we want to talk through a bit.
Maybe it's a step backward if the reason as to why they're feeling stuck at big tech, I think it's very dependent on that, right? So maybe their manager, maybe the style in which, they're working with their manager. And so maybe they could succeed at another big tech company. Like maybe that's, where they succeed versus if it is pace, if it is, these other constraints that we talked about, then like you said, you're probably right where it is actually very career additive rather than a step backward.
Yeah, that's a clever clarification. So let's play that out. Let's say the person said, and we could say, hey, double click on stock. You can imagine someone's like, yeah, my current manager just doesn't trust me. Or this current project feels like it's on the losing side of an internal battle. What will happen if one goes to a company at this segment is they're not going to get great management. It's a flat organization. They're just installing the function. So you're probably playing what you would consider out of position. There was a whole team at your current company that was devoted to X, and you're now being asked to do it on your own. Like, I'm writing copy. I mean, in the past, there was like a whole content management team with the 50 people, and here now I'm doing it myself. Like, this is crazy. So if you're the type of person who's like, look, I feel like I'm stuck because my internal situation is broken, but I need a lot of structure to succeed in my career, that is not going to get unstuck in this segment. What's going to get unstuck is your ability to talk to customers and build stuff much more rapidly. That's typically what PMs complain about when they're at big tech, and particularly in IC roles. Oh, this decision is made by 3 levels above me and it feels arbitrary and I have no influence and like it just feels like a waste of time. That's usually the case, but there are other cases where people are like, I'm stuck because the internal weather on my project is just bad, and I know there are many other places that are better, and the hot company isn't necessarily going to have better climate. It's just going to have a lot more growth and a lot less bureaucracy.
Okay, great. The next question. I saw in your Skip Coach interview, you talked with 2 executive recruiters, and they noted that some AI startups expect, quote, minimum 5 days a week, but Sunday's a workday too. And that 996 is very real in the office on Saturday as well. They said founders are working 6 days a week and expect their reports to do the same. Is this sustainable? Are people actually signing up for this?
People are definitely signing up for this. This is definitively not fictitious. I think, Carly, you and I both know many people that work at this pace. I think that, maybe I can get on my soapbox and note that I think that today, I think people like the concept of branding themselves as 996, and sometimes they take it to an extreme. I heard one company where they actually track like who worked the most hours that week. And that to some extent is somehow conflated with value. And so I think sometimes it's become gamified a bit. But, if you take away some of the LinkedIn drama and some of the sort of marketing around this, I think the reality is that there are 10 companies that are probably working on the same product in any given space, and they all are very well funded. And so there is this moment in time when the industry is moving so quickly that people are willing to sort of say, hey, for the next few years, work is essentially this P0. And we talked about this in the episode a couple of times ago when we talked about constraints, that 996 essentially means that it's not, you really are challenged to maintain real boundaries. This is when weekends are really, the expectation is you're mostly still online and working. The note that was made on this panel was that, Sundays where they interview because they're working during the other 6 days. And the question of, is this sustainable, is the answer is probably not in the long term. I think that, eventually those companies will ratchet back to the model that an OpenAI and the Metas and others kind of model. But I think the mistake that one would make is joining this segment and assuming that it's not something you can do on day one. I think you do have to commit for some period of time. And I do think you have to recognize that a lot of the founders are young and they don't have those commitments. And so that's a big piece of why they push so hard. This is what they're married to. And I think a lot of founders that are creating new companies work in this pace as well, where they quote unquote work all the time. But to institutionalize like Saturday as a work day, that is kind of happening in this segment. And that's the flag that I would say is taking place.
Okay, just a quick follow-up on that. Does it make a difference whether you're early in your career, in your PM career versus later in your career? Like you said, it seems easier if you're earlier, meaning that you don't have commitments, you may not be married, you don't have kids, so you could commit to 996 versus late in your career. But how should people be thinking about that depending on the stage they're at?
There is a bit of a self-selection that this does suggest, is that, the reality is as people get into their mid-stage of careers, their power years, when I speak with leaders that are in their, let's call it mid-30s, the conversation is as follows. It's like, look, I've got a mortgage or I'm trying to save for a house. My partner and I have young kids or we're starting a family. Our kids are under the age of 5, or at least one of them is. When you have kids that are under the age of 5, they are your P0. I don't know of anyone who's essentially like, no, I found a way to manage that. A 2-year-old is not a managed entity. So they are very much on high alert at home. Often their partner is working. And so they're not in a position to fully commit to just like focusing on work only, because they probably live in one of these bigger cities. And in order to afford it, they have to have both incomes. Their parents are in their 60s and perhaps in their 70s, depending on the situation, and they are starting to show some age. And so there's questions that they're dealing with around, hey, parents are retired, parents have maybe health issues. And on top of that, they don't go to the gym, they don't see their friends, and work is essentially a never-ending battle. Okay. So if that's the 80% of people that are in the sort of tech industry and the conversations you're having, hey, by the way, Sunday is a work day too, is a pretty rough conversation for that individual. So that creates a ton of stress. And so part of the reason we do this kind of podcast episode is to note that there are 8 segments, not one. And they may be quite qualified for this, but perhaps this is not the time in one's life to make the decision to be the adult at this stage of company. However, there are many people that don't have all the constraints I just signaled and that are in mid-stage, or they are able to sort of find a way to commit to this small period of time. And, when that then works out, the company matures, there's more layers, there's pace starts to become more manageable. They benefited because they were in early. So that there is a commit that they can take. But I don't think that people in their power years typically need to go to this segment to be able to career advance. And I think this is one of those areas where there's a huge distinction between men and women, because in the workforce, women are often, when they hit their power years, they're starting to have kids. And then, biologically, they have less ability to just power through it. And yet, power through it is kind of the name of the game in this segment. So we are going to see, unfortunately, and this I don't have a solve for, but these companies that are these hot AI companies that are in this early phases of growth are self-selecting to have younger and more male kind of employees. And I think that's deeply unfortunate. The good news is that once they get to a certain stage, they end up being a bit more sustainable, and they frankly need the leadership that women provide as much as men. And so it sort of quote unquote evens out. But it's not great that it's not a diverse stock all the way through because of this very specific need where they have to push harder than most people can sustain. And men are predominantly able to sustain it more because women often are able to support them at home. And so it's a rough spot to be in, to be honest with you. And it's sort of creating a new set of discrepancies that we haven't seen in the market in a while.
Is there anything before we go on to our final category, which is the higher risk plays, whether it's X-growth, mid-stage companies or founding early stage?
I mean, I would just note that there is, a lot more similarities than differences in the AI labs and these hot AI startups, meaning that they're typically not looking for AI expertise, but they're looking for people that know how to manage, scale, and are very wide in skill set and are very hands-on. I think that these companies have very volatile stock. And so there's a lot of unclarity around how the compensation will work out. But it is one of the unusual segments where it could end up being life-changing even for relatively junior roles. And it certainly has been life-changing in the AI labs and for early employees in these companies by paper valuation, at least. So risk definitely is a factor. I think that we've noted the pace being higher in this segment versus in the AI labs. And I think that you could argue that there is some brand risk and a lot of brand value to joining these. You're relevant because the AI companies are probably a signal to the future of how products are built. But at the same time, there's 10 companies building the same product. They're probably not all going to work out. So there's going to be some carnage in this segment. But in as much as we keep pushing on, look, if you go join these later stage companies, the way they build product is not going to be the modern way. These companies are building product in the most modern way. So you guarantee if you're a product person and you're trying to upgrade your intuition, if you go into this sector, your intuition, your language, your understanding of how much can be done with one person or with a functional engineering team that's very AI first and a go-to-market team that's very, very savvy, you're just going to know, you're going to have seen success in a way that is going to be very valuable to the next employer. So I'm a big fan of the brand value here, and I'm a big fan of a lot of this segment, but obviously it comes with some concerns and risks.
Okay, let's now go to those who are either likely at an X-growth mid-stage company, and almost what doors are they able to walk through next. So I'm a senior director at a late-stage private company between $100 to $150 million in revenue. I've been here 7 years since I was an IC, but our growth has slowed to 30 to 40%, and I'm worried the AI wave is passing us by. I'm torn between staying for the equity that might never materialize and jumping ship to learn AI properly. At what point do you cut your losses on a slow growth company?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is probably now. I think that there's a few clues that lead me to this, and I'll kind of walk the person through it. I think that what I worry about is there's a lot of folks that are in companies that are relatively slow growing that are qualified to get jobs in other segments, any of the segments that we've mentioned earlier. And I think that there's a lot of reasons why that person should seriously consider moving. And I think this has been a theme all year where I'm pretty down on companies that are slowing growth or that haven't been able to make it through because they're very well funded. So they're probably not going to go bankrupt. And because they're not going to shut down and go bankrupt, in the past they did, and then that released their employees to go find new jobs. Now they're kind of this sort of middle ground, Walking Dead type scenario. I mean, this company is probably not Walking Dead. But what I think that people need to be asking themselves is, if I'm qualified for something else, should I be pretty seriously considering it? Now, if they said, they've been there for 1 or 2 years, then I think that I would have perhaps a different answer than if they were there in 7. If they said that they're outside of the Bay Area or outside of the major tech hubs, I'd probably have a slightly different answer. So there's some nuances that we're going to cover here. But if I just sort of said, okay, if this person told me that I've interviewed at a handful of companies, some of them are big, some of them are hot, and in most cases, they're really interested in my background, but I've been here for a bit of time. I'm certainly well liked. I certainly know how things go. Is it worth me kind of sticking it out? My sense is that the career story you're building from year 7 to year 8 is going to be very, very small compared to the story you've built from 0 to 7. And so since your story is not dramatically going to improve, the bar that you would have to hit to really have this next year be career additive is pretty, pretty high and probably not up to you. It's probably up to the growth of the company and the situation and how they see you, et cetera. But if you're like, no, the company's fine, but it's not necessarily going to matter whether I'm here or not. I'm not on a project that's going to dramatically change the project. My story's not going to be huge. Then we come down to these questions around constraints. Well, tell me about what are you qualified for? What are you able to take risk around? Can you, take a position elsewhere, and do they see you, and can you get through it? But I think that this is a clear situation where you absolutely would be better off cutting your losses if you're trying to maximize career, unless there's some specific reason why this is the best job you can get.
And I think something interesting about this question, by the way, is they may not be aware of if they have the right characteristics to jump ship to learn AI properly, which is what they mentioned. What do you think are the best doors for them to walk through given their current role right now?
There's a good call out, right? So it says that, staying for the equity that may never materialize and jumping ship to learn AI properly. So the question is, what does it mean to learn AI properly is maybe the thing that we're double clicking on. You might move to another employer and also be not in a position to learn AI properly, but it might be very, very good to be in a year 1 in a different employer than a year 7 to 8 in this existing employer. So taking AI out, it still might be very, very smart for you to make a move, particularly if you're a little lower on the constraint side. However, if your goal is to just learn AI, it's not always the case that you have to learn it from your employer. In some ways, your employer is highly constrained. And, obviously this company has been around for a while. So it might be hard for them to do an about face and start moving to a very AI-centric kind of model. So my answer to these is, from depending on how the person learns in their time, everything from building a side project to taking a, set of Reforge classes to being kind of very, very in the weeds. Like there's a lot of things that you can do to sort of upgrade your skills and be very AI centric. And there's plenty of podcasts out there that talk about this. But what I would definitely say is your goal should be to maximize the next 10 years of career within your constraints. It almost certainly is not going to be on a slower growing company in year 8. You absolutely want to also be more familiar with AI products. And you can, in addition to doing a job search, look at that. If you're a mid-manager, you definitively want that because you might struggle to get positions in these other segments without additional skills. But instead of forcing your employer in year 8 to give you those skills, you need to find some creative outlet to make that happen.
Okay, got it. The next one adds a little bit of a nuance for us. So after being laid off from big tech, I got an offer to be a VP of product at a mid-stage company that's clearly lost momentum. They pivoted twice and growth is flat. It's a big title bump, and they desperately need someone to, quote, add AI strategy. But the team seems weak, and I worry I'll be a captain of a sinking ship. Is taking a VP role at a struggling company career suicide?
This is why I like what I do, because this is a really hard question. And I think this is the reason why, the LinkedIns of the world, when you read a post and they're like, oh, do an OpenAI, or oh my God, it's 996. I mean, people's lives are very much connected with their career. And, honestly, this person is asking, like, I know this is not the best company that exists in the marketplace, but it might be the best company I can get. And many times when I get these calls, they're asking for permission to take a subpar role. And my answer to this question is this might be the best job you can get, and it's better to be employed than not. Most of the time when I read on, LinkedIn or, on X, they're essentially like, you got to shoot for the stars, don't compromise, you're only going to be as good as the people you're surrounded with. But I think that being unemployed sucks. And it's really hard to improve when you are stationary. There's very few people that I know that can be sort of not in motion and have the self-esteem to constantly be kind of in a growth mindset. So I think a little bit of this depends on the breadth of the search and the time off. If the person said to me, I was laid off from big tech, I kind of had a panic attack because I've never not worked. I started interviewing. The first recruiters that called me were representing companies that weren't maybe the healthiest. And within a few weeks, I got a VP of product offer. I haven't really talked to many other companies. I'm early in process at some higher quality ones, but I'm wondering if I should hold on to bird in hand. I would say, in this case, I'd probably want to get a choice. Give me a spectrum. Being laid off from big tech these days is getting to a place where a lot of high quality people are being asked to leave. And that's not because they're no longer good. It's because those companies just are shifting priorities and they've kind of cut to the bone. So there's not that much fat left. It's really a matter of, hey, this project's not important. We're just going to remove it. And then you can always reapply. So there's a lot of high quality people that are being laid off from big tech. So I don't look at this and say, oh, this person may not ever be able to get another job. But if they've run a search, if they've actually looked at companies that are maybe at big tech, because clearly they were qualified at one point to work there, and they've also looked at maybe some of the higher quality segments like the Stripes and the Figmas of the world, and they've determined that this is the only job that they can get, then I would say take the job, recognize it's probably going to be a short tenure. Recognize that the equity may not actually be liquid. It may not actually pan out. Recognize that, adding AI strategy is going to help you in perhaps the next story. But, even if the company wasn't to succeed, you probably will be in a job search in the small number of years going forward. But if you're in motion, you can perhaps use that to parlay that into a better second company. You can build some skills that are really important. There was a huge difference from being a big tech and being a head of product, and you'll learn a bunch of new skills. So this definitely is a take the job if it's the best job that's available. Don't keep being unemployed in this marketplace. You have permission to redo the job search in a few years once you're employed. And just because the company is struggling, they might be giving you an amplified responsibility, which will translate well into your story.
Okay. Yeah. You actually took the words out of my mouth. The biggest lesson I got from that is going back to writing your story. Like you can write a better story, even if it is this type of company that may be struggling, but you do have this opportunity to add AI strategy. You do have this opportunity to make an impact. And that's probably better than being unemployed in terms of the story you're writing. So, okay. All right. This next one tackles a bit about the whole remote versus in-person world that we're in. So I'm a product leader in Austin, and every AI role seems to require SF or New York City. I've built my whole life here, kids in school, spouse with a local job. My current ex-growth company is fully remote but struggling. Are remote senior roles basically dead? Do I have to choose between my family's stability and my career relevance?
If you said to me, I want to be outside of the major tech hubs, and in particular, I'm outside of the Bay Area, I can't physically go into the office. I still want to be a leader in tech. The number of roles are rapidly declining. They're not zero. I think in my community, there's probably still a fourth of the companies that we work with that are in the sort of mid-stage, late-stage growth that are fully remote. So it does exist, but most of the time there's an in-person requirement, there's a hybrid requirement. So I think the question around family stability and career relevance, I think that you have to recognize that a lot of people have made this sacrifice. So I know this is frustrating for this individual because they're like, look, I built my whole life around Austin. There is a ton of people in San Francisco that would love to be in Austin and love to be able to afford a house and love to be able to, not have to deal with the pace, the traffic, the craziness, and perhaps be closer to family. And certainly a lot of those people did that. But I think the days where you can have it all, meaning like you could have your family that may not be in the area and you can make a great salary and you can work in leadership, I think are going away. I think the pendulum may swing back, but I think that if, it's just harder to find. Now, I know, for example, that there's a person in Austin who is working for Stripe in a leadership role. So they exist. So I'm just saying is you are having to choose between the number of future roles available to you and your decision to build your family unit and your decision to sort of settle in an area that doesn't have as much local tech presence. And that's a trade-off that you're making.
But don't you think that even if everything starts to be in person and you don't really have these remote roles, is there a world in which, AI obviously becomes so massive and everyone's using it, and so we're starting to now have companies in different hubs, not just SF and New York City? Basically, like the AI hub will grow beyond SF and New York City, so then you could have a really impactful role in AI and in person, but not in SF or New York.
Yeah, I think that you could imagine situations, obviously like Dell, for example, lives in Austin as an example. Are there going to be 100 Dells? In which case there's opportunities for this employee to live in Austin and actually work in a local company. It's possible. Will San Francisco have less of a stranglehold on the AI talent? And, absolutely. But I think that as a leader, I think you have to be somewhat thoughtful about the fact that it's a competitive market and there's rather few roles to begin with. And this constraint of being out, like not able to interview at a number of these segments, I think is challenging. I have a person, for example, right now who passed the leadership interviews at Microsoft, but they're not in a city where Microsoft has offices. And they cannot get an offer because there's an exception process to get a role outside of, in this example, Seattle and the Bay Area. So I think that they're seeing a definitive challenge about being outside the area and being a leader, and it just narrows the number of companies. Now, if you're very, very good, there'll always be a role for you, but it's really the question around, you have a constraint that's quite significant in this market. The last thing I would just say that we didn't really touch on is this segment is the one segment where you have to be very, very cautious that your equity may not pay out. And that's one of the real reasons why I tend to get pokey on this. The challenge that you face here is that you've earned equity and the companies can only pay that back if they go public or if they get bought. And this segment, you could end up in a situation where you either can't afford your equity, which we've talked about a bunch on this podcast, or the companies just never go liquid. And for leaders in particular, if most of your income is coming through perceived equity, you might be very underpaid. So like going back to this first guy's question where they were like, hey, I've been there for 7 years. I mean, this person's most of their earnings has been under market if the equity doesn't turn out to anything. So that's one of the reasons why this is a rough segment to be part of because of the sort of compensation dynamics.
Would your advice be different if the person was there for 1 to 2 years rather than the 7 to 8? Like, what would that look like if they were just there they joined and they've been there now for about a year or two?
the ability to have a good story in year 2, year 3 is pretty high. And in fact, you could argue that your best story, like if you kind of plot out like quality of story and time on a graph, most people at a company, your year 1 is relatively weak because you're just getting acclimated. And then it goes up in year 2 and 3. And then maybe your best stories are in that year 2, year 3, year 4, depending on the kind of project and qualifications and speed of growth. And then it declines almost by nature. So I think that year 7, year 8, year 9, your stories are just getting incrementally more marginal. And so to your question, if you're year 1 or year 2, I'm like, well, you may end up having realistic equity because the company did not give you equity well before the market corrected. It's been relatively recent. You also have a better story, and you're probably learning something that you didn't have before because it's a totally different sector, company, et cetera. So there's some value there. So year 7 is always the trigger for me.
Okay, we are going to go now to the final door, which is early stage or founding. So very much deciding, should I go start a company? Should I join an early stage company? Should I leave? All of that. I'm a university sophomore who took a semester off to work at a hot AI startup. They offered me a founding engineer with a competitive base and a large chunk of equity. They went through YC and have insane backers. On the other hand, I have an internship offer from an AI lab to join as a summer intern and then return to school. How do I choose what to do here?
No, I mean, person's obviously quite sharp. I love the fact that there are people like this that are out there. I think, again, the really personal question around what does someone think about and their relationship with school is really the core question here. I think that, one, you should just conclude that, this person's definitely going to get jobs. So the goal should not be that, boy, I have this situation where I have an internship offer, I have a full-time offer, and I'm a sophomore. If I graduate, what if none of that will materialize? What if I'll be like unemployed? I think we can take that off the table. I think that if you're able to get a job as a sophomore, you're probably able to get a job as a graduating senior. You might be better off doing the internship and then going and taking that kind of more sort of safer route. But really what this question comes down to is you've got 3 choices in front of you. Choice number 1 is graduate and then go and run a great job search. My sense is your qualifications, the quality of company that you get is not going to appreciably improve because you have a degree and a junior and senior degree of learning versus a sophomore degree of learning. Don't think of it as I'm going to get this degree and then, boy, am I going to be able to blow out people. Your junior and senior academic schedule is not making you a better candidate. You are definitively a strong candidate now because you're getting offers. And most schooling is not teaching you to be a better employee. It's going to mature you. Maybe it'll give you more friends, but it's not necessarily going to give you better career prospects, better job prospects in those next 2 years. However, you will almost certainly not return back to school. Historically, once you leave, it would be very rare for you to say, hey, I had to think as opposed to getting this next job, I think I want to go back and get my junior year and, be an older person on campus. It just doesn't exist. So I think you have to say that this is a bit of a one-way door, but I don't think that you are improving your job search prospects in particular by staying. So that's door number 1. Door number 2 is hot startup. Hot startup is potentially going to implode. It potentially won't work out, but most likely it will lead to yet another opportunity. So even if the company was to fail, you will continue to get potentially opportunities in the marketplace, but it may not be the best job you can get. And that's where the AI lab comes in. And so I think if I was to sort of counsel someone on AI lab internship, perhaps leading to full-time versus hot startup now, I would ask how well the person does with structure. So when I came out of school, I found in myself that the less structure that was surrounding me, the better I was, because I had a really wide skill set and I could create structure on my own. So I didn't need a pre-existing structure, like a manager, a clear set of requirements around I wanted to deliver. I could just figure it out. And in fact, that was liberating. And if that's this person, which it could be because they're already able to see some pretty high success early in career, It could be that it's just like, hey, give me a really interesting problem, throw me at it. I'll like hack, I'll stay up all night and I'll create magic. They're probably going to be best in the most unstructured, highest growth, crazy bunch of young people around them. And so I would say it is a very hard decision to walk away from that YC situation, because if it imploded, there's probably even a hotter company that they'll get picked up on. They're not losing that much by taking the structured academic approach or the structured internship meets AI lab approach. But if structure is where they're actually get the best out of themselves, then the AI lab is kind of the nice hybrid because it allows them to finish the degree, get the AI lab experience, and then probably there's another hard startup available for them and they can run a full search. So it's a little bit of a complicated one, but I think I touched on the choices here.
I'm going to weigh in just slightly on one element, which is what your focus on, right, is very much the career element of it, the career additive, what will set this person up best for right now, for in 5 years, 10 years, whatever it may be. At the end of the day, though, something really important to note is that this person is sophomore, right? So like 19, maybe 20 years old. And so naturally, they're at a very different stage in life than joining a company where they have graduated and they're in their maybe early, mid-20s, late 20s, whatever it may be. And so I don't think it necessarily correlates with happiness and, sat and just personal happiness, because I think it could actually be quite lonely. Like you may not connect with the people you're working with, even though you're doing super well and you're obviously very intelligent and smart, right? And you could keep up from a skills level. But I think there is actually this element to consider of being in such a different environment than college, which is you're around other really smart people probably, coming from, I'm guessing this person is at a good school. So I think that's something else just to consider, because like you said, they probably won't go back to college. And now they're kind of in this phase where they're always behind their peers in life, even mentally, and just maturely.
I mean, I think what your point is like, if you were confronted with this question, you would ask a question around where is the person's tribe and where do they find the most connection? Because you could argue that I love school. I'm feeling like I'm really settled well. I've only been here for 2 years, but frankly, it's exactly what I want. Going to this company feels like a mercenary job, but it's not, and they're not people I personally connect with. They're older, they've done it before, they clearly will do well, but now I'm going to be kind of exiting my tribe. You would say, boy, that's a real cautious. You'll probably have another one of these in 2 years. Don't lose this opportunity. On the other hand, if the person's like, I don't really connect with anyone at school, and frankly, I just like working and hacking on the side. And this company is just filled with a bunch of people like me. And my tribe is actually more in the startup than at school. Then you may have a different answer. So you would want to probe there.
Totally. Exactly. I think that's a really important distinction because, like you said, this person probably won't struggle finding a great job after college, given the opportunities they've already been presented. And so given that, I wouldn't want this person to feel pressure to say like, oh, I need to take these opportunities now. And that means actually giving up 2 years of being in college and getting a college degree, even though, like you said, may not make a big difference, but still just something. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that the one thing we both can absolutely agree and double bold is they probably will have similar choices after they get their degree. So this is not a unique moment in time, though. We all know stories of someone who's like, oh, and then that company was Palantir. And, there is potentially some uniqueness here. But I think that given it's a one-way door, we want to be pretty cautious about exiting one's happy place and tribe just for the perceived starting career, because you're going to work for 50 years. So if there's very few years left in school and there's 50 years of work, pausing that for 2 years versus not is not the most tragic decision.
Totally. Okay, let's go on to the next one. I'm paralyzed by indecision. My friend wants me to co-found a startup, and I've literally created financial models showing I'd make 40% less per hour as a founder. I keep telling myself it would look good on my resume when it fails, but I also calculated there's only a 10% chance of success. I want the adventure, but I also want holidays and sleep. How do I know if I'm just not cut out to be a founder?
The reason why I think Carly's laughing is because she's a founder and she's interviewed co-founders, and I could probably turn it over to her to answer this question more.
I think for me, why it is funny, because I think, one, the fact you're asking the question is probably is reason enough not to start it. Like, it literally comes down to that. And the fact that they're throwing in all these numbers, 40% less per hour, 10% chance of success. Like, I think being able to go start a company, there's a level of delusion and there's a level of I can't not do it. Like, that's kind of the bar I've embodied. But yeah, I would love, Nikhil, because you've obviously seen and you've advised in so many. So what do you think?
No, I think you put it incredibly well. I mean, my sense is that it's a very big leap of faith, and it's an emotional decision to found, not a pragmatic one. So if you're seeking a pragmatic solution, and this one, does it through spreadsheets and a holiday and sleep. So they're like, the way I would present it is, it needs to make financial sense. It needs to make sense from a pace and boundaries perspective. And it needs to make sense from a potential success point of view. And though I would agree with that at a high level, those are secondary characteristics. The primary characteristic is founding the journey that you want to go on. And, if the answer is I need to found because there's no other segment that speaks to me or sees me, I think that founding is the correct journey. And now we optimize within that. Is this the right segment? Is this the right co-founder? How should you think about financing? Is this pace of this company? What does it mean to you? Where do you locate it? All that good stuff. But if you're like, actually, I think founding is in the top 3 of the segments I'd consider. I could see myself working at Google. I could see myself taking a job at a startup, or I could see myself founding. You should not found. Because founding is one of those things where it's like, I just don't think I could see myself doing anything other than founding. And that is only driven usually by emotions. And the challenge that people face is the more successful they are, or the more experienced they are, the more those other segments get attractive and they become eligible. So, when you are 5, 10 years in career, people tell me this all the time. Oh, my next move after I'm a leader here is to go found. I'm like, no one ever does that. I mean, I shouldn't say no one. There's a few people in my group who are founding and they've had success in career, but typically they do it because they just have to do it. And so I think that it's just easier to found early, and it's easy to found when it's your emotional expectation and requirement. It's the irrationality of the decision, because almost everyone that founds are usually pretty qualified and they can probably get some other job. So it's not that they can't get jobs anywhere else. It's just they don't see themselves being happy or excited. And they've almost locked the other 7 doors, in which case the only door that remains is the founder. And that was certainly my experience when I founded early in my career. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Every part of it. The other element too, by the way, is we didn't even talk about this, but there's this element where if you're getting pressure from your friend, right? Like the friend wants to co-found, that's a whole bucket to dive into, which is you probably, shouldn't, unless you're a very complementary skill sets, like everything else. I've talked to a lot of founders on She Leads about that, right? Like a lot of it can end up in disaster purely because we were friends and then, we stepped on each other's toes, and there's all these other elements that can come into it. But overall, my very, this one I have a definite answer for, and I think it would be don't do that. Because yeah, it's also not sexy, once you're in it, there's a lot, it's your whole life, and you should be excited and happy to have it be all consuming, so you have to have that obsession and that delusion that even with the stats, it'll be a huge success, if you will.
I think that, yeah, maybe we can flip the question around if we're just to bottom out on this. I mean, I think that there is a set of people, you can imagine a question that's like the upside down version, which is like, I feel like I could get some jobs in other areas and other companies. Like I have a couple of great job offers. Having said that, despite my constraints and despite the fact that, it doesn't make any rational sense, I want permission to be able to do this crazy startup thing. I want to be able to do that. Is this a career suicide, right? So you can imagine the opposite question. That, I would say, you probably have very little to lose by founding these days. The opportunity cost exists. Oh, I'm trying to decide between joining OpenAI and founding. I mean, you might regret that decision, because if you don't get anywhere with founding and the OpenAI thing was like the next greatest thing, then maybe that's a bad decision. But most people, when they found, they're building a set of skills that are very, very relevant to the market. In other words, the number of doors that get unlocked after you've found it, even if you haven't had great success, if you're founding a tech startup, people just love the fact that you are, think about it, right? You're hands-on, you're wide in terms of responsibility, you have to be opinionated, you have to build skills like fundraising and selling and go-to-market. I mean, all these things that are required. The modern definition of product, in my example, but just generally leadership, is a wider, much more modern kind of look at sort of skills. And you're also like immersed in AI tools, right? So, I mean, it's like the crash course in upgrading skills. So if it's a crash course in upgrading skills, it's a great career move, but it doesn't mean everyone should just like intellectually go do that. It's this emotional thing. But if you do feel like emotionally you're designed to do it, it's a huge career move and very amplifying.
I love that. I'm so happy you made that. You kind of flipped it on its head, which is so good. And not only that, it very much like going back to you, how are you writing a better story? I think it very much adds to that. There's a big story to take from it. Okay, the next one. I'm 28 years old and I have time to take equity risks. I'd rather swing for the fences now than play it safe. Should I be specifically looking for pre-Series A companies where my equity percentage could be meaningful? Or is founding my own thing the only way to really capture upside?
Yeah, I mean, I think founding is a different skill set than joining. And so the math that you want to do, you can almost do this sort of, hey, I think I'll own half the company if I found, and I'll own 3% of the company if I join. But if I join a company that's 3%, I'm going to need to show different skills, and the company is already have established something. So essentially, they've mitigated some of the risk. So they have employees, they have a product, perhaps they even have some early product market fit. The skills that someone would have to be successful in one versus the other are pretty different. So I wouldn't look at it just as like, they're essentially the same skill and it's just a math, 50 is bigger than 3. No. To get to the same place that the company needs to get to is going to take a lot. And more importantly, you might be a much better founder than you are as someone who's joining. There's a skill around being opinionated, working without a net, and just like creating something from the ether, the complete blank sheet of paper. The moment that something exists, you're now in an influence role, you're now taking out the eraser and the red pen, and you already have a bunch of stuff on the board. You're helping the organization. It's not your company. So you can't change culture. You can't influence the strategy in the way that you could. So totally different skill. Typically, if someone's asking this question, they probably are maybe likely to be better off joining than creating from scratch. Because usually creating from scratch is like, I have an itch that must be scratched. I have to start. And so if it's not that irrationality, then I think that you probably are better off joining.
That concludes going through all of the different doors that we went through. Is there anything, what are your biggest takeaways that you want people to know as they are thinking of either they're at a current job, where should they go next? Should they go somewhere next? How are you thinking about it? What are the biggest lessons that you want people to take?
I think we're going to put this series to bed now. I think we've got 3 parts, and I think that, I don't see myself in part 17 in next December recording this. So we're going to put the series to bed. I think maybe the things that I want people to understand is that everyone's career advice is pretty different, and that, you should be on the tip of your tongue. I think you should be very clear and articulate about your constraints. Location, geography is a big piece. The compensation is a big piece. Your pace is a big piece. I want people to really understand, are they a real builder, or are they truly a manager, or are they a manager that could really be hands-on? I think that's an important spectrum. I think that they also have to have a really clear sense of what they're qualified for. And that's where the doors start coming in, is that these companies that we typically talk about, they're not all the companies that are out there, but they're some of the most common that people are seeking to understand. They're all selective, and they're selective in different ways. And your career advice is going to be radically different if 6 of these doors are unlocked versus 2 versus 8. And I tend to really spend a lot of time getting that first half understanding and then trying the knobs on all these doors and then asking people to like, hey, these are the 2 doors that are most appropriate for you. You should walk through those. And these days, usually the higher quality, more established companies are the most common destinations for those that have leadership careers that have some common set of constraints. They're like, hey, I'm Bay Area. I want to work pretty hard, but I also need to make some money and I want to learn AI. You're probably going upstream. And then there are some extreme cases where people are qualified for these hot companies and they are taking that adventure and hoping that they can sustain and hold on for the ride. And then I think these ex-growth folks and founders, they're very specific career advice because they're such anomalous but very common areas in our industry today. So my kind of net is like, keep coming into Kel AI. I'm going to continue to train. I'm going to continue to watch the questions. I would love nothing more than to take the next 500 and go through systematically the edge cases. We can't get everyone's question answered individually, but by trying to keep training and building these things out, I think we're going to improve our ability to help people navigate these really choppy waters. And until then, I'm really excited about this series. I hope it goes well. And I wish you the happiest of holidays, Carly. And thanks again for joining me this year. It was a real pleasure.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.